One funeral, two coffins, and a puzzle no one expects. Welcome to Clue Hunt. I am your host, Elena Gray. Where are you tuning in from today? Your comments make this journey special. Let's attend together. It was a quiet Thursday morning in the village of St. Bede's. The mist hadn't yet lifted from the fields, and the hedgerows were heavy with dew. Outside the old stone church, villagers gathered in their best black coats, holding umbrellas and murmuring softly. It was to be a funeral. Nothing out of the ordinary in a village this old. But when the church bell rang not once, but twice, a hush fell over the crowd. Miss Marple, seated in the third pew from the front, lifted her head slightly. That second bell, she had heard it, so had everyone else, but no one spoke of it. You see, in St. Bede's, a single toll of the bell marked a funeral. Two tolls? That hadn't happened in 60 years. The vicar, Reverend Clement, stood before the altar. His face was pale, his hands folded more tightly than usual. "Today," he said, "we lay to rest our dear sister in Christ, Mrs. Althea Dawson." Hesitated. "And due to a clerical matter," he added, "there will be an additional coffin present. Please remain calm." An additional coffin. That was not the sort of thing one said at a village funeral. Two men from the undertaker's office entered just then, solemn and slow. They carried the first coffin, Althea's, beautifully polished and adorned with white lilies. It was exactly as expected. But then came the second. It was nearly identical. Same polish, same size, same solemn procession. Except there were no flowers. No family. No nameplate. Only a small wilted red rose placed just beneath the handle. A murmur rippled through the pews. Heads turned. Whispers stirred. Miss Marple remained still, her gloved hands resting gently on her handbag. The service continued, but the air had shifted. Something felt wrong. After the hymns and the readings, the congregation was asked to proceed to the graveyard. Two freshly dug graves waited side by side. That's when things took another turn. Edith March, Mrs. Dawson's longtime companion and now her heir, stepped forward. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight. She pointed at the second coffin, her voice loud enough to stop the mourners mid-step. "Why?" she asked. "Are there the initials EM carved into that second box?" Everyone turned. Sure enough, carved in the wood, nearly hidden in the corner, were the faint letters EM. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. Edith March. EM. Someone gasped. A few villagers stepped back. The undertaker swore he hadn't seen the carving before. He insisted the coffins were untouched at the chapel. He was sweating now. The vicar looked ready to faint. Miss Marple turned quietly, unnoticed, and walked toward the back of the church. She slipped behind the altar and into the sacristy, where the funeral records were kept. One of the pages had been torn from the register. Only the date, yesterday, remained. The rest had been ripped clean out. She stood still for a moment, letting the silence speak. Someone had interfered with this funeral. Someone wanted two coffins buried today. And someone, she suspected, had left behind that red rose on purpose. When she returned to the crowd, most were gathered around the graves. Some comforted Edith, others just stared. But Miss Marple looked at the second coffin again. It hadn't arrived by mistake. It had been sent. The rain had begun to fall by the time the mourners left the churchyard. Gentle at first, more mist, then storm, but enough to send umbrellas up and quicken the pace of quiet footsteps. Only Miss Marple lingered behind, standing beneath a shared umbrella with Edith March, who had not spoken since the initials EM were spotted on that second coffin. Miss Marple turned to her gently. "Edith, dear, Are you feeling quite all right? Edith gave a short nod. I'm trying to be. But why my initials? That second coffin. It wasn't supposed to be there. I swear to you, Jane, I had nothing to do with it. I believe you, Miss Marple said softly, but someone clearly wanted you to see it, and wanted you to feel something. Edith's voice lowered. Fear, maybe. Miss Marple didn't answer directly. She simply looked again at the two graves. The vicar had postponed the burial of the second coffin, understandably so. It now sat in the vestry under lock and key, as if the very wood might reveal its secret. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple placed her umbrella by the door and poured herself a small cup of tea. She didn't sit. She stood at her window, staring out at the narrow lane that led toward the church. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. She returned to her desk and began writing a short letter addressed to Inspector Giles Reed. She requested his presence in the village, not formally but as a quiet favor. She knew he wouldn't refuse her. He never had. By the time the sun broke through the clouds the next morning, Inspector Reed had arrived. They met in her parlor. Two coffins? He asked, brows raised. One meant, Miss Marple replied. The other meant to mislead. Reed leaned forward. Any idea who arranged it? Miss Marple tapped her teacup thoughtfully. No one local, I suspect, but the initials carved into the second coffin, Im, are too precise to be random. It's not just a coincidence, it's a message. Reed nodded slowly. Could it be meant for Edith March? She believes so. But more interesting is the timing. That coffin appeared the night before the funeral, which means someone accessed the vestry, opened it, and placed the box after the undertaker. Locked up, Reed frowned. So someone had a key. Or, Miss Marple said, someone never left. That afternoon, the two of them visited the church once more. The vicar, now less flustered but still nervous, showed them the vestry. The second coffin stood in the corner. Untouched. Miss Marple examined the latch. There's no sign of forced entry, she said. Yet the page from the funeral registry was torn. That's not an accident. Reed stepped toward the coffin. Shall we open it? The vicar turned pale. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on Reed's arm. Let me. She had seen too many terrible things in her time to be frightened by wooden hinges. Reed helped her lift the lid. Inside comma. There was nothing. Nobody. No lining. Just a folded white sheet, and lying atop it a single object. A locket. Gold. Old. Slightly tarnished. Miss Marple picked it up carefully. She opened it. Inside was a photograph. Faded, but visible. A woman in a dark coat, and beside her a young girl with a wide smile. Miss Marple's breath caught. Because she recognized the child. It was Edith. Edith, no more than 7 years old. But the woman, the one beside her. Miss Marple stared at her face. And then she remembered. Her name was Margaret Evers. She had vanished from the village 35 years ago. Presumed dead. Never found. And now her locket was resting in an empty coffin, engraved with the initials E.M. Miss Marple closed the locket and handed it to Reed. Someone hasn't forgotten, she said quietly. And they want Edith to remember too. The E. Moon hung low that night, casting pale silver across the long-forgotten path that led to Farringdon Hall. The estate had stood quiet for years, long enough for ivy to swallow the east wall and dust to claim every sill. Yet Miss Marple, walking with steady steps beside Inspector Reed, noticed the faint imprint of recent boot tracks in the mud. Someone else had been there recently, someone who still visited the dead. I remember this place, she murmured. Lady Farringdon held charity dances here. Dreadful food, but very fine piano players. Reed smiled faintly, but his eyes were alert. You're certain there's a rose arch? Oh yes, Miss Marple replied. The gardeners used to boast it bloomed in December. but only Lady Farringdon knew what lay beneath it. They rounded the corner, and there it stood, a crooked archway long overgrown, tangled with sleeping vines. Once it must have glowed with red and gold blooms. Now it looked tired, half swallowed by thorns, and Time. Reed knelt near the base. So this is where Margaret's diary said she left something. Miss Marple knelt too, slower, more carefully, and pressed her gloved fingers into the earth. The phrase was, "The truth is hidden beneath the rose arch." That wasn't metaphorical, Giles. Margaret was too frightened to write in riddles. She wanted someone to find it. Together they dug, not deep, just enough to break the topsoil. And within minutes they struck something hard. A metal box. Old rusted. Padlocked. Reed looked at her. "Shall we?" Miss Marple nodded. He pried it open with a pocket tool. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a stack of papers, faded, yellowed, but protected. From Time. He pulled one out. It was a ledger, an employment record from 34 years ago, and there, on the margin, were two names written in a different hand. Margaret Evers, struck through. And beside it, transferred to Maid's quarters by order of C.F. Reed's brow furrowed. "C.F.?" "Charles Farringdon, Miss Marple," said quietly. The son took over the estate after his father's death. They examined the remaining papers. One was a letter, unsigned but damning. She knows. She's seen the books. If she speaks, the agreement falls apart. We must silence her before she ruins everything. Reed folded the paper with care. This was never just about a disappearance. "No," Miss Marple agreed. This was about silencing the one person who noticed what no one else did. They took the box back to the vicarage, locking it in the vestry beside the coffin, still untouched. Miss Marple suggested leaving the locket inside for now. She believed whoever placed it there might return. Whoever was behind this wasn't finished yet. The next day, word spread that Farringdon Hall had been disturbed. Villagers whispered. Some remembered Margaret's name. Others didn't. But everyone remembered the feeling of unfinished business, a coffin with no body, initials with no explanation. That afternoon, Miss Marple received a visit. Edith March stood at her door. "I remembered something," she said, quietly. "From when I was little." They sat together in the parlor, sunlight warming the room. "I was about 6, Edith continued. "Margaret was very upset. I heard her arguing with a man outside the house one night. She told him she wouldn't stay quiet, that she had written it all down." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Could you see who the man was?" Edith shook her head. "No, but I remember the smell of tobacco, strong, bitter, not like a pipe. Cigars, maybe." Miss Marple sat back. "Charles Farringdon smoked cigars," she said. "It was always part of his presence." Reed returned that evening with a typed file, Margaret's name, he said, placing it on the table. "There's no death certificate, no official transfer. In fact, after that last entry in the hall records, she disappears from every document. But there is one oddity." He pointed to a bank transfer, a small, regular payment made every month from an unnamed account to a private nurse in Cornwall. The payment stopped the same month the Farringdon estate shut down. Miss Marple looked at him. "So she was hidden," she said. "Kept somewhere, paid off, and then vanished." Reed nodded. "We'll need a warrant to trace that account, but we're close." That night, something happened. Miss Marple returned home after a walk and found a single white envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a card. No message. Just an old photo, torn from its frame. It showed 3 people. Margaret Evers. Charles Farringdon. And a child. Edith. On the back, written in old ink. "Not all flowers bloom in sunlight." Miss Marple held the photo for a long time. "And in that quiet room," she whispered, to herself, "the past has roots, and someone is digging them up." The morning began with a thick fog clinging to the hedgerows of St. Bede's. It muted the village's usual sounds, the clink of teacups, the postman's whistle, as if the past had wrapped itself around the present, holding its breath. Miss Marple stood by her kitchen window, fingers gently resting on the old photograph that had been slipped under her door the night before. Margaret Evers, Charles Farringdon, and Edith smiling, unaware of the weight that would one day fall. Upon her name, she didn't believe in ghosts, not truly. But she believed in the things they left behind. By mid-morning, Inspector Reed returned, carrying a thin brown file. It took some favors and an early call to Truro, he said, but I've got the nurse's records. They sat in Miss Marple's parlor, teacups untouched. The nurse's name was Anna Daltrey, Reed explained. She worked privately for almost 20 years, mostly discreet cases, clients who didn't want questions. Miss Marple nodded. Clients like Charles Farringdon. Reed opened the folder. There are letters here, instructions, payments, but here's what's interesting. The notes changed tone around 1992. The patient, never named, began having memory lapses, night terrors, and then this. He passed a torn note across the table. The handwriting was shaking but legible. I remember the girl's voice, her crying. They locked me away, said it was for my health. But I knew what they were doing. And now they want me to forget, but I won't. Miss Marple read it twice. That handwriting, she said softly, matches the diary. So Margaret was alive, Reed confirmed, for at least 15 years after she disappeared, hidden under a nurse's care, likely not voluntarily. And then, Miss Marple added, silenced, again. They were interrupted by a knock. At the door. It was Edith. She looked shaken. In her hand was a letter. I found this among my aunt's things, she said. It was hidden behind the drawer of her old desk. She handed it to Miss Marple. The paper was brittle, the handwriting familiar. It was addressed to Edith. My dearest girl, if you are reading this, then something has happened, or perhaps someone has let the truth surface. I only ever wanted to protect you. You were innocent, a child. You didn't know what Charles was doing. You couldn't have. But I did. I tried to stop him. I failed. Please forgive me for leaving. I never truly left. I only hid because I had to. But now I leave this with you, the knowledge that not all shadows are behind us. Some walk beside us still. Love always, Aunt Margaret. Tears welled in Edith's eyes. Miss Marple took her hand gently. She never forgot you, she whispered, even in hiding. Later that afternoon, Reed made an announcement. We've traced the bank account. It was opened under a false name, but funded from an offshore account once linked to Farringdon Holdings. And the last payment, Miss Marple asked. Made 13 years ago, he said, just a week before Charles Farringdon's own death. They were silent for a long moment. So the only person who could have ended the payments, she said slowly, was him. Reed nodded. After he died, the nurse retired. She passed away last year. And Margaret? Edith asked. Her voice barely above a whisper. Reed hesitated. There's no record of what happened to her after that. Miss Marple stood. Her voice was firm now. Then we must find where she was kept. That cottage. That room. It's the only way we'll know if she truly died, or if someone helped her vanish again. It was late afternoon when the first clue came. Not in a letter or a ledger, but in a faded map folded between two old recipe cards in Margaret Evers's diary box. Miss Marple found it while rereading the final pages, tracing the lines of ink as if they might speak. The map was simple, sketched by hand, but clear enough. It showed the grounds of Farringdon Hall, and beyond it, a winding path into the trees marked with one word. Cottage. She held it up to the sunlight. This, she whispered, is where she was kept. By early evening, Miss Marple and Inspector Read had set off. The pines behind the estate were old, thick with years of undergrowth. Few villagers walked that far anymore, not out of fear, but out of habit. The path had long disappeared beneath bramble and moss. Read moved ahead with measured steps, clearing the way with his walking stick. Miss Marple followed steadily, map in hand, her knitted scarf tucked tightly around her neck. After nearly an hour, the trees began to thin and the underbrush gave way to a small clearing. There it stood, a weathered stone cottage, no larger than a tool shed. Its windows were boarded, its door crooked. Ivy crept up the sides, but the roof had held. Someone long ago had cared enough to maintain it, if only just enough. Read approached first. No footprints, no disturbance. Miss Marple stood, very still. "It's been waiting," she said softly, "all this time." They pried open the door. Inside was darkness. The kind of darkness that felt heavy, like breath held for too long. Dust spiraled in the fading light. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, medicine, and something older, sorrow maybe. The front room was sparse. A small bed, a wooden chair, a chest of drawers. Everything was neatly arranged. Nothing moved. On the wall was a faded photograph of a garden in bloom. Underneath it, carved into the wood, were two initials. M.E. Margaret Evers had lived here. And possibly died here. Miss Marple opened the drawers. Inside were handkerchiefs, a few broken combs and letters, all unsent. Dozens of them. All addressed to one name, Edith. Each letter was written in the same trembling hand. They began with love, slipped into confusion, and ended in silence. Read stood by the bed. "The mattress is barely worn. She didn't move much, likely stayed in that bed for years." Miss Marple picked up one letter and read it aloud. "Today, I remembered her laugh. I think it was spring. She was wearing the yellow dress. I hope she doesn't forget me, too." Edith had never received them. Someone had kept Margaret here, hidden from the world, and from her only living family. Read checked a small cupboard. There was a bottle of pills inside, long expired, a tray with cracked porcelain, a book of psalms. And then something curious. Taped to the back of the cupboard was a small envelope. Inside was a photograph. A young Margaret standing beside a man in a military coat. Not Charles Farrington. Someone else. Miss Marple took the photo. She narrowed her eyes. "This man," she said slowly, "was never mentioned." Read leaned in. "Do you recognize him?" "No," she said. "But look at the lapel. That insignia. It's French. This wasn't just a nurse's retreat. Margaret was sent away with someone watching her." Read exhaled. "Which means someone outside Farrington was involved. They searched the rest of the cottage. In the attic. Nearly missed behind a crumbling hatch. They found a locked trunk. Read broke the latch. Inside were boxes, each labeled with a year. From 1988 to 2006. The last one had only a single page. Inside. Miss Marple read it in silence. Then she passed it to Read. "They said if I speak, Edith dies too." The two stood still. The birds outside had gone quiet. For Margaret, silence had been a prison. Not just for her, but for Edith as well. Whatever Margaret had known, it hadn't been just about the estate or Charles's affairs. It was about Edith, perhaps even her past. That night they brought the evidence back to the vicarage. The vestry, where the second coffin still stood, was growing colder each day. Yet Miss Marple believed someone had been returning. She'd noticed a smudge on the coffin's side, fresh despite the dust. So she waited. She sat quietly in the pew that night, a shawl around her shoulders, the locket in her pocket. At midnight, the church door creaked open. A shadow moved inside. Miss Marple did not rise. The figure moved toward the vestry. It was a man, tall, wrapped in a long coat, wearing gloves despite the summer heat. Miss Marple stood at last. "You came to see?" "Her," she said. Voice calm. The man froze. He turned. It was not someone she recognized, not at first. But then the jawline. The eyes. A faint resemblance. Her palm against the edge. "This panel is loose," she said. "Give it a nudge." Reed did. The shelf clicked. A hollow thump. And then, slowly, it opened inward. He was related to Charles Farringdon. "I only came," he said slowly, "to see if the past was truly buried." Miss Marple stepped forward. "She died in silence, locked away for years, forgotten, except by the one person she loved." "She was dangerous," he snapped. "She kept records, names, connections. She could have ruined all of it." "All of what?" Miss Marple asked. "The Farringdon name." He didn't answer. "I know who you are," she said. "You're his nephew, Colin Farringdon. You were only a boy when Margaret disappeared. But you were old enough to be groomed, taught how secrets are buried. Just like she was." He didn't deny it. "You sent the second coffin," she continued. "The red rose, the initials. It was your warning to Edith." He stepped back. "She shouldn't have started digging." "She didn't," Miss Marple replied. "I did." Silence. Then footsteps behind them. Inspector Reed. "Mr. Farringdon," he said calmly, "you're under investigation for obstruction, conspiracy, and possibly unlawful imprisonment." Colin didn't resist. He only said, "You have no proof." Miss Marple handed him the final letter from the cottage. Reed read it aloud. "If I speak, Edith dies too. That," Miss Marple said softly, "is all the proof I need." It rained. That morning, not a hard, crashing sort of rain, but a gentle drizzle that felt like the sky whispering apologies. The kind of weather that made one stay inside, wrap hands around warm cups, and think too much. At St. Bede's Vicarage, Inspector Reed sat across from Miss Marple, reading over the night's official statement. Colin Farringdon had been taken into custody, though not formally charged. Not yet. "There's still no direct evidence," he said quietly. "Plenty of suspicion, no confession. And the property where Margaret was kept, it was leased under a shell name." Miss Marple nodded, already expecting this. "Of course, Farringdons don't leave fingerprints, Giles. They leave favors, money, and frightened silence." Edith sat in the corner, pale and exhausted. She hadn't spoken since the arrest. Her eyes kept drifting toward the table where Margaret's last note rested beside the locket. "I keep wondering," she finally said, "if I had remembered sooner, if I had tried harder." Miss Marple interrupted gently. "No, dear. You were a child when it happened. And children believe the people who protect them. Sometimes those protectors are the ones with the darkest shadows." Edith looked up. "Do you think she forgave me?" "She never blamed you," Miss Marple said softly. "She wrote to you for years, even when no one answered." Reed cleared his throat. "There may still be a way. The ledgers, the ones we recovered from the Rose Archers, mention a safe, hidden in the East Study at Farringdon Hall. The place has been boarded up for years, but we've secured permission to search it." Miss Marple stood. "Then we search it now." They arrived just past noon. Farringdon Hall looked sad in the daylight, not menacing but tired. The gates groaned open and birds scattered from the hedges as they walked toward the crumbling east wing. Inside, plaster hung from the ceiling like cobwebs. Wallpaper peeled in slow curls. But the air. It smelled of something untouched, like a memory sealed in wax. Miss Marple moved slowly, eyes scanning each surface. She paused beside a bookcase, and pressed behind it, built into the wall, was a small iron safe. Reed pulled out his tools. Within moments, The lock gave Dot inside were papers, folders, bound ledgers, and beneath them 2 cassette tapes. Voice. "Recordings," he muttered. Miss Marple opened the folders. They were full of contracts. Names of shell companies, transfers, bribes. And page after page of payments to Nurse Anna Daltrey, the same nurse who had kept Margaret hidden. "This," she said, "is what they were hiding." Reed examined the tapes. One was labeled April 1993. The other had no label at all. He played the first. It began with static. Then a voice, and shaking but clear. "My name is Margaret Evers. I was taken from my home in 1988, locked in a cottage. I was told Edith would be harmed if I tried to leave." Miss Marple closed her eyes. She had heard confessions before. But this was the voice of a woman who had survived far longer than anyone knew. The tape continued. "Charles Farringdon had dealings with people he shouldn't. I found the records while helping with payroll. He falsified documents, laundered money. I was just trying to protect the estate and Edith." Reed stopped the tape. "That's enough," he said quietly. "It's admissible, and it ties directly to Charles. We can finally move." Back at the station, Reed began compiling the report. Miss Marple sat with Edith, hands folded over Margaret's. "Lock it." "It's over," Edith whispered. "No," Miss Marple replied. "It's begun. Truth is never an ending, dear. It's a door." By the next morning, the entire village of St. Bede's had heard something had shifted. Not just in the soil beneath the church, where 2 coffins still rested, but in the air. There's a certain tone the villagers take when scandal mixes with sadness. It's softer, less nosy, more aware. Like they know that grief has teeth, and the truth sometimes bleeds. At the vicarage, Edith sat near the fire, holding a cup she hadn't touched. The tape of Margaret's voice had played in her head all night. Every word had landed not like sound, but like memory. "She saved me," she whispered. Miss Marple, who sat beside her, nodded, and she left breadcrumbs so you could find her, even if she never expected anyone would. Inspector Reed arrived with papers in hand. "We're ready," he said. "The prosecution's agreed. Between the tape, the payment trail, the nurse's records, and the cottage, we have everything. Colin Farringdon will be charged." Edith looked up. "With what?" Reed answered gently. "Unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, financial fraud, and obstruction of justice." Edith didn't smile. She only nodded. Later that day, Reed held a press briefing in the village hall. Reporters came from outside, not many but enough to startle St. Bede's. People who had never heard of Margaret Evers now heard her name spoken with sympathy. She became, in a way, more visible in death than she had been in the decades she lived. Miss Marple did not attend the briefing. She returned instead to the church. The vestry had been opened. Inside, only 1 coffin remained. Margaret's was gone. Not stolen, moved respectfully. With Edith's permission, it was to be buried next to her sister, Edith's mother, on the hill overlooking the village. Margaret would finally lie beside the family she had protected. Reed met Miss Marple there. He stood silently as the new headstone was placed. It bore only her name, Margaret Evers, beloved aunt, brave soul. She remembered what others forgot. Miss Marple placed the locket inside the casket herself. "She can rest now," she said. Reed asked, "Will you attend the trial?" Miss Marple shook her head. "The truth is out. That's what mattered. The rest belongs to the law." He looked at her. "Why do you do it? Keep digging?" She smiled faintly. "Because secrets don't stay buried. And because I've learned that even whispers can echo, if someone is listening." That evening, the church held a small memorial. No pomp. No flowers. Just Edith, the vicar, Miss Marple, and a handful of villagers. They lit candles and read. A psalm Margaret had marked in her diary. Truth shall spring out of the earth, and righteousness shall look down from heaven. The next morning, the second coffin in the vestry, the one mistakenly delivered with the initials E.M., was removed. It was empty, still. But it no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a message received. The courthouse in Marketdown was small, built of grey stone and lined with ivy, as if even justice needed shielding from time. It hadn't hosted a case like this in decades, not since the railway scandal of 1921, which Miss Marple remembered very well, and had quietly helped unravel, though few knew it. Now, she sat quietly in the back row of the gallery, a simple hat upon her head, knitting in her lap, eyes ever watchful. At the front stood Colin Farringdon, thinner now, no longer the calm, shadowy figure who had crept into the vestry. He wore a dark suit, but nothing about him looked comfortable. The courtroom air had a way of peeling off layers people usually kept hidden. The charges were read: unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy to conceal a person, financial misconduct, destruction of records. He pleaded not guilty. His solicitor argued that Margaret Evers had chosen solitude, that her stay in the cottage had been voluntary, and that the financial trail was uncertain at best. But when the tape played and Margaret's own voice trembling through the speakers, the courtroom shifted. They told me Edith would be hurt, that if I said anything she'd disappear too, so I kept quiet. For her. Silence followed. Even. The judge looked down for a moment, before lifting his gaze again. The prosecution presented the payment records, the falsified ledgers, and the signed authorizations under fake names. But the strongest witness came not from paperwork. It came from someone unexpected. Her name was Mrs. Isla Trent. An elderly nurse from Cornwall. She had worked with Anna Daltrey for years, and she remembered Margaret. She wasn't allowed visitors, she said. Didn't even know where she was, not really. They told her she was ill, unstable, but she wasn't. She was scared. She paused, and she asked about Edith every single day. Miss Marple watched Edith from across the room. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she did not cry. She listened. Every word mattered now. On the third day of the trial, something unusual happened. A man in a grey coat arrived during recess. He wore gloves and carried a briefcase. No one had seen him before. He handed a letter to the clerk. Then he left. The judge read the letter in private. Later that afternoon, he addressed the courtroom. There has been a sworn written statement submitted anonymously, he announced, from a former solicitor of Charles Farringdon. It confirms knowledge of Margaret Evers' illegal detention and admits that funds were transferred under orders to ensure her isolation. The courtroom stirred. Colin Farringdon turned pale. Miss Marple folded her knitting calmly. The pieces she knew had finally locked together. By the end of the week, the verdict came. Guilty on all primary charges. Sentencing would follow, but justice, long buried like a rose root under frost, had pushed its way to the surface. A's. People left the courtroom. Miss Marple remained in her seat. Inspector Reed came to her side. Well, he said, you were right. Again. She smiled. Not right, just patient. He glanced at her knitting. What are you making now? A scarf, she said, for Edith. The trial was over. The village had settled. The church bell rang gently again, not in mourning, but in rhythm with the summer wind. Children played near the pond. The bakery reopened its shutters with warm buns and quiet gossip. Life, it seemed, had exhaled. And yet Miss Marple knew better than to trust silence. She was back at the vicarage, sipping tea, when Edith arrived with a cardboard box. These were in the attic, she said, setting the box gently on the table. Old photographs. I thought you might like to see them. Miss Marple lifted the lid. Black dash and dash white memories peered up at her, some smiling, others blurred by time. Margaret as a young woman, Edith as a child, garden parties, a Christmas by the fire. Then one photo stopped her completely. It showed a group of 4 people standing by a greenhouse. One of them was Charles Farringdon. Another, unmistakably, was Margaret. But it was the third person who caught her eye, a woman in a nurse's uniform, and next to her, barely visible but unmistakable, was Reverend Jasper Wills. Miss Marple's expression changed only slightly, but her fingers gripped the frame. "I didn't know Reverend Wills knew Margaret," she said. Edith leaned in. "I don't remember him from childhood." "You wouldn't," Miss Marple said softly. "He wasn't the Reverend then. He arrived nearly 10 years after Margaret disappeared." She turned the photo over. In faint pencil was written, "Greenhouse, day June 1987. That was before Margaret vanished, Miss Marple whispered. That night. She visited the church alone. The door was unlocked. The lights were low. Reverend Wills sat at his desk, candlelight flickering across his face. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, without surprise. "What brings you here?" She held up the photograph. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he sighed. "I wondered when that would resurface." "You were there," she said gently. "Before she disappeared. You knew them. You knew her." Wills nodded. "I was a different man then. Assistant chaplain, hired by the Farringdons during their troubled years." "Troubled how?" "They had debts," he said, "and secrets. Charles was growing paranoid. He didn't trust the staff. Margaret had discovered something dangerous. And you knew?" "I suspected. I heard arguments, saw fear in her eyes, but I said nothing." "Why?" Wills looked away. "Because Charles was paying my mother's medical bills. I kept my head down." Miss Marple watched him closely. She was locked away for years. "I know. You helped bury the truth. I prayed for her every day." Miss Marple's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. Prayer is no replacement for action. He looked at her. "I've tried to serve penance since. The vestry, the grave, the second coffin. I saw what Colin had done. I couldn't prove it, so I left clues, quiet ones." Miss Marple realized it now. The odd verses read during services. The anonymous letter to the court. The unlocked vestry. "You were helping," she said, "but only after the damage was done." He nodded. "Why now?" she asked. "Because you came. And you listened." She didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, "The truth always finds someone to listen. Eventually." She left the photograph on his desk. As she walked home, the fog rolled in from the fields. But Miss Marple never feared the fog. She had learned long ago. Fog may hide the road ahead, but it cannot erase the path you've walked. The morning. Sky over St. Bede's was a pale silver, with a softness that made everything seem washed clean. The trial was behind them. The name Farringdon, once whispered with awe or dread, now belonged to headlines and legal records. The villagers had returned to their gardens and shops, their teacups and benches, as though time somehow had paused just long enough for the truth to be seen. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, the box of Margaret's belongings open before her. Edith had brought it that morning, the last thing retrieved from the hidden cottage. Beneath a few scarves, a dried rose, and a small wooden comb, there was a diary. Not the kind with long entries. Just a thin notebook, its pages spotted with age, and smudges of ink. Most of the entries were dated simply. May Tuesday, rainy morning, after tea. Many were single lines. Saw Edith smile in my dream. Today I felt forgotten. I hummed the hymn from Easter. It helped. I still remember the smell of lemon soap. Miss Marple read them slowly, quietly. Each entry a stitch in. A life that had been unravelled in secret. Then she reached the final page. It was dated July 3rd, 2006, the last year Margaret had been alive. If someone finds this, please tell her I tried. I tried to tell the truth. I tried to protect her. I tried to survive. If Edith ever hears my voice, let her know that I remembered her every day, that she was never the reason I vanished. The reason was fear. But she was always my light. Miss Marple closed the book gently. She placed it beside the locket on the mantel, where sunlight now filtered through the lace curtains. Later that day, Edith came for tea. She was quieter now, older in spirit, but steadier somehow, like someone who had walked through shadow and come out carrying light. They didn't talk about the trial or the headlines, or Colin Farrington's sentencing. They talked about Margaret. About her garden. Her love for poetry. How she always cut her toast into neat little squares. And in that quiet exchange, the story was no longer about coffins or courts. It became about memory. And dignity. And justice. Not the loud kind, but the kind that lives in peace. As Edith was leaving, Miss Marple handed her the diary. "She wrote this for you," she said. Edith took it as one might take something sacred. Outside, comma. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling through the rose bushes. In Miss Marple's garden. She looked toward them. Two roses bloomed side by side. One pale pink, one deep crimson. And she thought to herself, some truths take decades to surface, but once they bloom, they never fade. She returned to her chair. Picked up her knitting. And began again. 3 weeks had passed since the trial, and while the headlines had faded, the aftershock still stirred beneath the surface of St. Bede's. Truth, once dug up, rarely settles quickly. It lingers like smoke after a fire, faint but impossible to ignore. And so when a pale blue envelope arrived at the vicarage, postmarked from a village in Provence, it was not altogether surprising. What was surprising, however, was who. It was addressed to Miss Jane Marple, care of Reverend Jasper Wills, St. Bede's Church, Berkshire. The handwriting was neat, foreign yet practiced. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper and a pressed lavender stem. The letter read, "Mademoiselle Marple, I have followed the story of Margaret Evers with quiet breath and trembling hands. You do not know me, but I knew Margaret once and before she was taken. She came to France briefly as a nurse during my brother's recovery. She spoke often of Edith and of secrets. I believe she left something with us, something she was afraid to carry. If you are willing to come, I will show you, but come quietly. Not all wounds are healed. Lisette Fay, 14 Rue des Oliviers. Saint-Rémy de Provence." Miss Marple read the letter twice. Then she folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and looked out her cottage window. A light breeze danced over the garden. The 2 roses, one pink, one crimson, still stood side by side. Later that day, she visited Edith. "I believe your aunt may have left something behind," she said gently. "In France." Edith's eyes widened. She was in France. Briefly, it seems. Long before she vanished. Edith hesitated. "Do you think it's safe?" Miss Marple didn't smile. "At my age, dear, I don't ask about safety. I ask if it's necessary." And so by the week's end she boarded a quiet train with a brown suitcase, a tweed coat, and Margaret's diary tucked safely inside her bag. Saint-Rémy was a village, full of sunlight and shadows, winding streets, blue shutters, and hills that shimmered with olive trees. At 14 Rue des Oliviers, Miss Marple found a stone house with red geraniums on the sill. Lisette Fay answered the door, wearing a faded scarf, and eyes that held too many stories. They sat in the garden. "She saved my brother's life," Lisette said, "and she saved something else, a ledger." "A ledger?" Miss Marple leaned in. Lisette nodded. "She asked me to keep it hidden. She said if anything happened to her, someone would come looking one day. Someone kind, someone with questions. Rose went inside and returned with a small wrapped bundle. Inside was a notebook, different from the diary. It was lined with numbers, names, transactions in both English and French. But what caught Miss Marple's eye was the final page. It had a name. Henri Vallon. Miss Marple looked up. That name was in the Farringdon ledgers too. A supplier, but no one knew who he was. Lisette's face changed. Henri Vallon, she whispered, was not a supplier. He was a broker of people. He helped Charles Farringdon move women, discreetly, illegally. Margaret found out. Silence settled between them like dusk. Lisette continued. She came to warn me. She said Henri had returned, that he was working with someone new, someone younger, someone in England. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the pages. Colin, she said softly. Colin wasn't just protecting the past, he was rebuilding it. Lisette looked down. If that's true, then your work isn't finished. Miss Marple nodded. That night in her small guest room, Miss Marple opened Margaret's diary and wrote a single line on the blank inside cover. Truth grows quietly, like lavender, but it never forgets to bloom. She folded the ledger, packed it away and prepared to return to England. Because this mystery was never just about one funeral. It was about what lies beneath silence. And who keeps burying the coffins. Miss Marple returned to St. Bede's quietly, without announcement or fuss, just as she had left. The village was as she had left it, calm on the outside, but she now knew that much remained hidden beneath its calm soil. Edith met her at the gate, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face. There were no words needed. Marple simply handed her the small bundle, the ledger from Provence. Edith took it with both hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "There's more, isn't there?" she asked. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and I believe someone here already knows it." She visited the churchyard that afternoon, walking slowly past the rows of graves until she reached the overgrown eastern wall. Ivy curled around old stone. Behind it, wild rose bushes had grown untended. As she brushed one aside, she noticed a small brass plaque nearly hidden beneath the thorns. It read simply "In Caf." Miss Marple crouched and brushed away the dirt at its base. A small stone hatch sat beneath it, no bigger than a bread box. She tapped it twice, then again. It sounded hollow. She stood back. The initials weren't just a memorial. They were a message. Charles Augustus Farringdon. Someone had hidden something here, and she had a suspicion it hadn't been placed there decades ago. She returned that night with Inspector Reed. Identities, the cover of dusk. They dug carefully, not damaging the roots. Beneath the plaque, inside a small rusted tin, they found several sealed envelopes. One contained money, the others, documents. One bore an emblem, a serpent wrapped around a sword, and a seal stamped with red wax. Reed examined it. "That's not British, that's military, foreign, possibly intelligence-related." Miss Marple held the second envelope. Inside, another list of names, but these were recent. Reed frowned. "This is a current client roster. It's a ring, active, operating quietly. Look here, transfers, dates, initials, this isn't over." They paused. Miss Marple said quietly. "The network didn't end with Charles. It only paused until someone bold enough and young enough took the reins." Reed asked, "Do you think Colin was the head?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No. Colin was a disciple. The head hides still." Later at the vicarage, Miss Marple pulled out the name from the French ledger again, Henri Vallon. But this time she cross-referenced it with the new list. And there he was, not as a name, but a code name. Viper. She turned the page. Beneath Viper, a single note. Willow. Cottage scheduled return visit. Miss Marple's hands froze. Willow Cottage. Where all this began. The site of the wrong coffin. The place where Edith had received the wrong funeral. It wasn't over. She contacted Edith the next morning. Have you returned to Willow Cottage? Edith shook her head. I haven't touched it since. Miss Marple said quietly. Then it's time we went back. By the afternoon they stood once more at the gate. The ivy had grown even thicker now. The air was still. Too still. Miss Marple moved slowly, each step deliberate. The sitting room was exactly as before, the sofa untouched, the framed photos on the mantel, and the faint smell of lavender and hum. Something darker. Reed searched the kitchen. Edith stood frozen in the hall, staring at the door that led to the cellar. The other coffin came from here, she whispered. I don't know why, but I feel it. They opened the cellar door. The stairs creaked. It was dry, but the walls were newer than the rest of the house. Freshly repointed stone, as if something had been bricked up and then rebuilt. In the far corner, behind a dusty tarp, they found a hidden panel. Reed pried it open. Behind it, a narrow corridor. Miss Marple's voice was low. Not a cellar, a passage. They followed it, flashlights in hand. At the end, they found a locked metal door. It took Reed nearly an hour to force it. When it opened, what lay beyond chilled even Miss Marple. A room. Clean, cold, recently used. Chair in the center. Chains on the wall. A medical cabinet in the corner. Miss Marple whispered. This wasn't storage. It was preparation. They searched every inch. Behind the cabinet. In a small crack in the wall, Reed pulled out a sealed envelope marked, to be burned if discovered. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Phase 2 begins in September. Willow, cottage confirmed as temporary staging. Viper will be arriving under alternate identity. Do not delay shipment. Miss Marple's hand trembled slightly. She said, C doesn't stand for Colin. Reed looked at her. Then who? She didn't answer immediately. But in her eyes something flickered. She knew. Not the full name. Not yet. But someone had inherited the Farringdon legacy. And he or she had plans still in motion. The morning after the discovery at Willow Cottage, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlour, her teacup untouched, her knitting needles still. She wasn't thinking about stitches or patterns now. She was thinking about codes, about initials, about secrets that speak not in full names, but in letters, and how the letter C had suddenly stepped out of history and into the present. A ghost from the past, now writing new instructions in the dark. Reed arrived with the envelope in a sealed evidence pouch. Still no fingerprints, he said, and the paper is modern, untraceable. Miss Marple nodded. The kind used by professionals, she said, professionals who know how to erase themselves. They returned to the list from Provence. 30 names, contacts, payments, dates. Most led nowhere. But 3 repeated. A Swiss account, a London office, and a name, not real but known in whispers. Ashcombe. Wasn't that a firm? Reed asked. Legal? Years ago? Miss Marple closed her eyes. Yes, but only as a front. Ashcombe was dissolved after a scandal in 1992. But I remember something curious. One of the partners vanished, not arrested, not questioned, just gone. She stood and walked to her bookshelf, pulling down an old newspaper clipping from a 1993 edition of the Times. She read aloud, Martin Crowley, junior partner at Ashcombe and Lang, leaves firm citing personal reasons. No further statements released. She tapped the name. See, she said. Reed stared at the page. You think this Crowley? I don't think, she replied. I remember, because Crowley had once come to St. Bede's, quietly, long ago. not as a solicitor but as a visitor to Charles Farringdon. He had attended a service, had tea with the Reverend, and left before anyone asked too many questions. She found an old parish photo. Third row. There he was. Same eyes, same jaw, a man in a grey coat standing just behind the choir. She whispered, "He never left the network. He just changed clothes." That afternoon she and Reed travelled to a quiet estate in Surrey. It was listed under a company name. But the caretaker, an old gardener with crooked fingers, remembered the man who came once a year, always alone, always polite. "Mr. Crowley?" the man asked. "No, ma'am, he never gave a name, just said he liked the roses." Roses again. Always roses. Inside the estate they found little: expensive furniture, dustless bookshelves, a cabinet of foreign wines. But in the study, Miss Marple found something chilling: a book. Blank cover, thick binding. Inside hand-drawn maps, not of land but of houses, dozens of them. Basements, hidden doors, secure rooms. All in Britain. All marked with tiny red dots. Reed paled. "This isn't just Willow Cottage," he said. "No," Miss Marple whispered. "It's a network of hiding places for people, for operations, for trafficking." They turned to the last page, a message in block handwriting. "See, if this fails, move the archive to Hollow Ridge, use the vicar's cellar, burn the rest." Reed said nothing for a long time. Finally, he whispered, "The vicar." Miss Marple's face did not move. But in her voice was steel. "Not Reverend Wills. He's not capable. He's part of the story, yes, but not that part." She pointed to the next line. "Viper expects silence, no mistakes tolerated." She closed the book. And for the first time in years, Jane Marple felt something she rarely did. Anger. Cold, quiet, precise. "This isn't over," she said. Reed looked at her. "Do you want protection?" She smiled faintly. "No, I want answers." The road to Hollow Ridge twisted through woodland, old stone, and memory. It was not marked on most maps, the sort of place where even postmen paused before entry. The cottage itself was nestled among tall yew trees, flanked by ivy-choked walls, and partially sunken into the earth. Reed parked the car quietly. Miss Marple stepped out. Her eyes narrowed, her step steady despite the moist earth beneath her shoes. This was not an ordinary village house. It was a place built with intention, to watch without being seen, to keep without being heard. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air was cold and dry, too dry, in fact, like a room constantly prepared for inspection. No clutter, no warmth, just purpose. There were 2 rooms on the ground floor. One had no furniture at all, just a fireplace and a long crack running up the wall. The other held a single desk and 3 wooden chairs, each facing different directions, as if they weren't meant for conversation, but for silence. Reed checked. The drawers. Empty. Miss Marple moved toward a photograph on the wall, a framed picture of a seaside cliff. She gently tapped the glass. Hollow. Behind it, a concealed space. Reed pried it open. Inside, a small steel box. And inside that, another list. This one held addresses. All of them in the south of England, all attached to initials. Each name had a note beside it. Some said moved, others cleared, but 3 were marked pending. And one was circled in red. St. Bede's Cellar Vicarage, final clearance pending. Miss Marple stared at it. Then, slowly, she turned to Reed. "It wasn't about what had already happened," she said. "It was about what was about to happen." Reed swallowed. "You think they're still using the vicarage?" "I think it was never just a mistake that led that coffin to the wrong funeral." Reed said, "That coffin, it was deliberate." She nodded. "A test, to see if the cover held, if the silence continued." They searched the rest of Hollow Ridge. In the basement they found files, old, from the 90s and 2000s, marked, in French and English, names crossed out, women, dates of birth, no surnames. Some had stamps, returned, others simply vanished. It was not a place of rest, it was a holding station. Back in St. Bede's, twilight had begun to sink, the sky into grey-blue. Miss Marple insisted on walking directly to the church alone. Before word could spread, the vicarage was quiet. Reverend Wills met her at the door. He smiled, but his face had changed. It wasn't guilt. She saw now. It was dread. Miss Marple, he said softly, you found more. She nodded. I need the key to the cellar. He hesitated. There's nothing down there. She didn't flinch. You once believed silence was protection. Don't make that mistake again. He reached slowly into a drawer, pulled out a brass key and handed it to her. You may not thank me for what you find. She took the lantern. The cellar door creaked. Step by step. She descended. The cellar smelled of chalk and damp history. Shelves of old books, cobwebs, forgotten things. But at the far end, behind an old wardrobe, was a second wall. Newer. Cemented. Not part of the church's design. She tapped it. Hollow. A false wall. With effort, she pried at the edge. It fell, open with a soft crumble. Inside. A small space, no larger than a cupboard. But what lay there made her blood run cold. Photographs. Dozens. Young women. Some looking afraid. Others unconscious. One was Margaret. Younger, paler. The others. Strangers. Beside them, papers. Signed by C, stamped with foreign seals. Some marked cleared, others still pending. Miss Marple stood very still. Then she picked up the last photo in the pile. It was of Edith. Not recent. Old. But stamped with a date from only 3 months before. Someone had taken it without her knowledge. Marked it. Prepared it. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was quiet. They were going to take her again, finish what they started. Behind her she heard footsteps. She turned. Reed stood at the stairs, pale, holding his phone. There's more, he said. Crowley never left England. He's been moving from church to church, using faith as a mask, and he's back. Somewhere. Near, Miss Marple said quietly. He never left St. Bede's, just changed names. They turned toward the door. In the distance. Church bells rang. Once. Twice. Then silence. As if the village itself were holding its breath. The church stood silent beneath a low silver sky, the kind that seems to hush the world before a storm. Miss Marple walked slowly through the gates of St. Bede's, her footsteps soft against the gravel path. The roses in the churchyard trembled in the wind. The bell tower loomed above, watching, waiting. She didn't flinch. Not now. Not after all she'd seen. Inside, the pews were empty. Candles flickered on the altar. The space felt larger than usual, or maybe it was just quieter. Reed followed a few steps behind her, but this time it was Miss Marple who led. Her eyes swept the nave, past the stained glass, past the organ, and then she looked up, not to the front pulpit, but the smaller one built into the side wall, the second pulpit, used only during special sermons, or for watching. A shadow moved. Crowley, she said softly. The figure did not answer. First. Then, from the shadows, a man stepped forward. Older now, grey at the temples, sharp around the eyes. He wore a plain black coat. No clerical collar, but he walked like someone used to being obeyed. You shouldn't have come alone, he said. Oh, but I haven't, Miss Marple replied. I brought the truth with me, and it's heavier than you think. He gave a thin smile. You should have let it be. The past was buried. Yes, she said, in a coffin, beside another. Wrong name, wrong body, but you were watching. You wanted to see if anyone noticed, and when I did, and you moved faster. He said nothing. You used churches, she went on, as hiding places, and ministers as shadows. You moved women through the network Charles began, and when it crumbled, you rebuilt it, smarter, colder, and you made sure no one would suspect a man of God. He stepped down slowly. I never claimed to be a man of God, he said, just a man of order. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Then why hide in churches? Because, he said, people are quiet in churches. They listen, they kneel, they don't question. And what about Margaret? She asked. He paused. For the first time his face darkened. She was never meant to stay in the system, he said. Charles was supposed to end it. But he grew weak, emotional. She escaped. He panicked, locked her away. I stepped in years later to finish the job. And Colin? Recruited. He understood the value of silence. Until the funeral, Miss Marple said quietly. That second coffin was your undoing. You brought 2 bodies, 1 mistake, and now the whole chain unravels. Crowley's smile faded. Do you think this will stop it? Me here? There are others. You can't kill a structure by burning the roof. No, she said. But I can show the villagers the blueprint, and they will never kneel so easily again. From the rear doors, footsteps approached. Reed stepped. Forward, followed by 2 officers. Crowley looked toward the altar, as if seeking sanctuary. There's no sanctuary for men like you, Miss Marple said. Not in stone, not in God. Crowley turned slowly. He didn't run. He simply raised his hands. Take him, Reed ordered. As they escorted him out, he passed Miss Marple. He looked at her. Do you know why it lasted so long? He whispered. She didn't answer. Because no one believed a quiet village could house something so dark. Miss Marple looked him squarely in the eyes. Then you never understood quiet villages. We see more than you think, and we forget far less. The doors closed behind him. The wind picked up. And for the first time in weeks, the bell of St. Bede's rang on its own. Not for a funeral, but for truth. That evening, Miss Marple walked with Edith through the garden. The 2 roses still bloomed. Pink. And crimson. Will you leave? Edith asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. No, dear. Not until the garden forgets, and gardens, I've found, I never forget. She paused. Then added more softly, especially when they're watered with truth. 1 week had passed since Crowley's arrest, and yet the village of St. Bede's had not returned to normal. Because something had shifted, not just in the walls of the church or behind the ivy of old cottages, but in the very way the villagers looked at one another, like people who had finally opened a box they'd always known was there, but never dared to unlock. And inside they hadn't found monsters, only shadows that had been allowed to grow in silence. Miss Marple sat once more in her parlour. A light rain tapped against the window panes. On the table beside her sat a single item, Margaret's original diary, now returned from police evidence. She had read it again, carefully, slowly. Every word now carried the weight of something sacred, a record not just of suffering but of courage. The funeral had been held again, properly this time. Margaret was laid to rest in the churchyard beneath the old yew tree, next to her sister's grave. Edith had stood quietly beside the casket. She did not cry. Her face was pale, her posture steady, but Miss Marple saw the truth in her eyes. She finally knew. Found sometimes knowing is heavier than grief. Reverend Will stepped down after the truth emerged. Not guilty of direct wrongdoing, but guilty of turning away. He had allowed too many questions to go unanswered. A new vicar had been appointed, a woman surprisingly, younger but thoughtful. She reopened the church doors every morning and left them open until dusk. A small change, but not an empty one. Read visited Miss Marple for tea. They're still digging into the other. Names, he said. Some of them slipped away. Others will be harder to prosecute, but we've shut the house. The files are out. The silence is broken. Miss Marple poured his tea gently. Silence, she said, was always the weapon. It allowed evil to pass as routine. The moment someone said something, even something small, it cracked. Reed nodded. We couldn't have done this without you. Miss Marple shook her head. You would have, but perhaps not in time for Edith. He was quiet for a while, then asked, Do you ever regret getting involved? These things, they're darker than anyone imagines, she smiled, but it was a small smile. Regret? No. But I do mourn. For all the people who will never be named. For those who went through the same doors and never came back. We solved this, but not all of them will be solved. A silence settled between them, But it was no longer the kind that hides, It was the kind that remembers, That evening, Miss Marple walked to the cemetery alone. The sky was golden grey, the air cool. She placed 2 roses on Margaret's grave, one white, one crimson. She whispered, You left clues. Not because you were careless, but because you knew someone might take care enough to follow them. As she turned to leave, she paused beneath the yew tree. Its branches swayed gently, the rain beginning to slow. She thought of all that had happened, the 2 coffins, the strange funeral, the ledger in Provence, the rose behind the wall, the photo in the cellar, the man in the pulpit, and the shadows. Beneath every smile in St. Bede's. And then she walked away, not quickly, not triumphantly, but quietly, Because justice, in the end, is not loud. It's not always satisfying, It does not erase what was done, But it stands, like an old tree, bending, gently in the rain, proof that someone remained, and listened, and remembered.